Hello and welcome to episode number 33 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, January 18th, 2015. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Welcome to the show, Brad. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
I'm Brad Phillips. I am a media trainer and presentation trainer who helps clients both develop the message that is most effective for their audiences and learn how to deliver it for different forms of media.
And you have, Brad, I don't quite remember how we found each other, but I know that I've been a major, huge follower of your awesome blog, MrMediaTraining.com, for years now.
Oh, thank you. And likewise, Melissa, when you came on the scene, it was immediately clear that we were kindred spirits in how we look at the world and how we approach media interviewing and crisis communications. I think we just found each other through social media and being in touch with one another.
Probably. I do remember, and actually I was telling somebody this recently, I remember when I first started blogging, which was the way of, my initial entry onto the scene of this is how I'm going to get my ideas out there. And I, of course, as a new blogger, you get a lot of criticism and stuff from different people in the field or the industry or whatever, and you kind of develop this thick skin over time. But I remember when I first started, you sent me a private message telling me that I was doing a really great job and you're really enjoying the posts and to keep it up. And it was those words of encouragement at the time that I was like, wow, that's what I needed. So thank you for that. I don't think I ever I told you that.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. You earned it. And now that I know that my words encouraged you to be a blogger, as you continue to grow and blossom in business and take business away from me, I will remember that and maybe hold you to account with some kind of commission.
Sounds good. I doubt that I'm taking business away from you, though.
No, in all seriousness, you and I mean this. You see the world very similarly as I do, and occasionally we have slight disagreements, and that is what is so great about this industry and connecting with people who are similar but not exactly the same in social media. Because there's an expression, if two people agree on everything, one of them isn't thinking. So to surround yourselves with really smart professionals who generally see the world similarly but are willing to challenge and debate points that we see one another making, it makes all of us stronger. So I really appreciate your presence.
Oh, and likewise, and thank you. I agree completely. And the other thing is, if everybody saw everything similar, the same, life would be boring.
That's for sure. Now, I think we can agree when we see these these crises occurring either on social media or in traditional media, you wish that those other people would see the world a little bit more similarly to us as well. I mean, we tend to see the same types of disasters over and over again. My blog that you mentioned, Mr. Media Training, since late 2010, I've been doing this feature, the worst crises, the worst video media disasters of the month. And what's amazing to me is that we still see the same types of disasters occurring over and over, the people committing the same errors. So I think one of the things for people like us, people who are practitioners in crisis communications, is we can continue talking about best practices all that we want. But as long as there are human beings on the planet, there will be people who continue to make the same mistakes repeatedly.
It gets frustrating after a while, especially, and I remember it happened probably about a year ago. I don't remember the specific case, but I swear I wrote a detailed blog post about a must do not and how to avoid it. And I think that exact same week there was this viral issue, not really a crisis, but major issue that went viral. And I remember writing a blog post in response to that saying, hello, did you not read my post? Where were you?
I think that's the nature of humanity, isn't it? That we have millennia of information and history and love stories and things that go wrong. And yet, until we are the ones personally who make those mistakes, we don't seem to learn it. So I think to some degree, it's just the very nature of being human that forces us to make some of these mistakes on our own.
And it gives us a mission, you and I and professionals like us, to keep going and to help them.
Absolutely.
So we are going to talk about spokesperson in crisis or crisis spokespeople today, you and I.
This is a good topic.
It is a good topic. And you know what? It's a topic that gets a lot of questions around it.
It certainly kept me busy for the past 10 years or so, both in private practice and for the 5 years or so I've been blogging. A lot of questions about this. Certainly the implications of social media on crisis come up repeatedly. But then there are those questions that are kind of more evergreen, like who should I select as my spokesperson in a crisis, are the types of things that we've spent a lot of time thinking about and probably are so obvious at this point to you and I that we no longer spend a lot of time on it, but are very much present and front and center for a lot of our clients.
Absolutely. So let's start. And I just for people listening, I want you guys to know that even if you are a very experienced spokesperson, I have Brad here with us today. And so we're going to utilize his time and we're going to get into some really, not necessarily just the basics. I do want to start off with maybe a couple basic questions, get everybody on the same page. But I'm really looking forward to diving into more of the, what would I call that? The more advanced type of stuff for spokespeople.
We can definitely talk about some of the nuance.
Absolutely. So I guess to start off the conversation, what makes a good spokesperson, and primarily what makes a good spokesperson for crisis?
Well, I think audiences are really looking for a couple of questions to be satisfied from a spokesperson in crisis. The first one is, does this person get it? I know that sounds like a simple question, but on some kind of gut level, that's really what it comes down to for audiences. Do they get it? And the second question is, if that person gets it, are they competent and capable enough to address the problem? So that's what I think audiences are looking for from a spokesperson in crisis. And, our colleague Jane Jordan-Meyer really synthesized this in a very nice way by saying it comes down to some kind of balance of the heart and the head. It's not enough simply to be a compassionate spokesperson in crisis if victims are involved, if you don't have at least some of the facts. And nor is it enough to have all of the facts if you're not able to communicate it with some kind of compassion for the people who are affected. So I'd say that heart and head balance is absolutely critical and one of the most important components for a good spokesperson in crisis.
I agree. Jane is so fabulous on this subject, and what she calls emotional intelligence, another way of bringing in the heart and head. And actually I don't know if you've seen or heard it, I have a really great podcast with her on exactly that topic. What is emotional intelligence, and what does a leader of a crisis, what does it take actually to be a leader in a crisis?
Yeah, and that topic is so important. As we're recording this podcast, in just the previous week, I've seen a couple of examples of pretty big crises and institutions responding publicly to those crises. And what gets stripped out of it completely is any semblance of humanity. So you're left with these very corporate-sounding template statements that clearly were drafted probably by a board of attorneys. And there's not a single person, it seems, in the room like us willing to push back and say, where's the humanity in this? This doesn't address the people who are affected in any way. And so one of the things that I'm telling clients now is always remember in a crisis, you're just a person talking to another person. Such an obvious statement, and it's shocking how many times companies in crisis don't remember to include that in their statements.
And today with social media and all of the new rules that have come with social media and just the online world in general, you don't get away with it. Not only do you come across as heartless, lacking that emotional intelligence, as Janie would say, but you will not get away with it. You will be faced with an issue within the crisis because you will be criticized to your core on that lack of compassion and that human level.
Absolutely. When I started my blog in 2010, I was somebody who was doing this kind of analysis of the kinds of statements that companies and institutions are putting out and dissecting them and talking about what worked and what didn't. And one of the really interesting things that's happened in the 4 or 5 years since is that now bloggers for big blogs, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Gawker, are doing the same thing. Now, certainly they weren't inspired by me to do that, but the point is that that type of analysis that used to be more of a niche has now become mainstream, with reporters and bloggers taking on that role themselves. So when companies don't release a human-sounding statement today, they're not just criticized by people in the industry like us. They're criticized by much more mainstream outlets.
And on the flip side of that, you have people like Jan Gomeshi, who came out trying to sound human, trying to manipulate the situation as it turned out, and gain that appeal and the good side or the good grace of people, and win that crisis by coming out as a human. And actually what burned him, of course, was how badly how well, I suppose, he manipulated the situation.
Well, I think there's something really important to that, which is we know and we write about what are the best practices of how to respond in a crisis. And so we kind of offer the template. And anybody can use that. People can use it for good or evil. People who are guilty of something can look at that best practice template and try to apply their situation to it themselves, thinking they'll get away with that because, after all, they're using the best practices. But the one thing that they're forgetting is it has to come across as authentic to the public. And I think that regardless of education level, regardless of demographics, one thing I think that is universal is people have very sophisticated BS detectors. When somebody is spinning and evading and inauthentic, they know it. Something on a gut level is telling them that. You can only fool people for so long, and I think that's where he went wrong. You could try to apply the template to your situation, but if you're doing it in a way that is obviously inauthentic, it's going to backfire, and that's exactly what happened in his case.
Yeah, absolutely. That one's a great one. A great case study. It's not a great crisis. It's a great case study that kept going for a while, actually, with so many different angles and so many different lessons than what we typically see, because of what he did. And I don't mean because of his offense, but because of what he did in order to get ahead of the story and manipulate the story, and how that turned out against him.
Yeah, and on the flip side of his approach now, of course, is Bill Cosby's, who went to the silent approach of literally, and I don't remember ever seeing this before, during an interview when he was asked about rape allegations, and now there are multiple allegations. I think the latest total is something like 16 women have stepped forward to claim that he in some way sexually assaulted them. During during an interview with National Public Radio, he was asked 3 times to comment on it, and he shook his head no. The host had to say, Mr. Cosby is shaking his head that he won't comment on this. I've never seen that before, and of course the strangeness of that approach only encouraged more media coverage. It did nothing to extinguish the crisis.
Absolutely. So what would you recommend for spokespeople who don't want to answer a question for different reasons, but who also don't want to be criticized or let that, instigate or provoke further criticism and further speculation on the subject by not responding?
That's always a difficult question to answer in the abstract, because you really have to know the facts of the individual case to make a recommendation to that client about what to do. I mean, using Cosby's case as an example, let's assume that he's telling somebody behind the scenes, his attorney, his publicist, somebody, what the facts of the case are. You need that information to be able to make a recommendation. So let's say, for example, that Cosby is basically saying, in words or not, yes, I'm guilty of those allegations. Maybe just disappearing and saying nothing is the best thing to do. Because if you come out publicly and admit that you did those things, then your career goes away completely. If you say nothing, at least there's some ambiguity about whether he's guilty or not. And then, of course, if you were to comment and if he's innocent, of course, there would be a much different remedy. Now, that's a case I personally wouldn't take. If I thought that a client was guilty of what he is accused of, I would want no part of reputation management for that person.
That's a line that every professional has to draw for themselves as well.
I mean, we talked about that. We have the template, know what often works in crisis, and then we have to make decisions about for which clients in which situations is it ethical to deploy that bag of tools and techniques, and to be deploying it on somebody's behalf who is, and again, we're assuming for the sake of this conversation that there's guilt there, not that we know that at this point. But if we did know that, I think there's a real ethical question about do we want to use our techniques and everything that we've learned to help people in crisis get out of or somehow mitigate their reputation. I personally am very happy in a situation like that, assuming, of course, that there's guilt, to let the person be held accountable for what they've done.
Agreed. And it meant, like, again, it's a personal decision. And it was interesting with the Jan Gomeshi case where the crisis firm that he had originally hired, I think when more truths came out and you could really tell that he really did manipulate the story and the situation with CBC, with everybody that he needed to do that with, that he felt that he needed to do that with. It was interesting to see their response and when they dropped him, and actually for their own reputation, they took the smart move of, in my opinion anyways, of dropping him and releasing the statement that they did and then moving on.
Yeah, I probably as a practitioner would have done the same thing. There's an ethical question there that they're taking the money when times are good and the second things turn bad and he really needs counsel, suddenly they don't want to cash the checks anymore. I may have, given that case, done the same thing, but I do think it's not an easy black and white decision for practitioners to make.
Agreed. Somehow, though, my gut, and again, I don't have any personal I don't have any personal ties or insider information on the Gomeshi crisis, but my gut is telling me that they weren't given all the facts. And it's like when you hire legal counsel, if you're not completely honest with the person or the company, the professionals that you're hiring to help you through a difficult situation, they can't do their job properly. And then when it turns out, so my gut is telling me that he probably did manipulate the situation more and withhold very critical information that when it came out, they said, hey, this isn't what we signed up for. This isn't what you told me. We need to distance ourselves from this for their own ethical reasons.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. You're bringing me back to the debut episode of the show Scandal, of course, that Kerry Washington crisis communication show, where that was the exact advice she said to the first client who was ever on that series. If you lie to me, you're gone. We're not going to help you anymore. That sacrosanct truth between client and practitioner has to exist for us to be able to do our jobs well.
Absolutely. Otherwise, literally, we can't do our job.
We can't, or we are manipulated. We are suddenly asked to be a mouthpiece for what that person wishes were the facts instead of what the facts actually are. So it does put practitioners in a very bad situation.
It's interesting. And actually, it brings me, so before jumping on this call with you, I tweeted out, I know you saw it, if anybody had any specific questions for you that they'd like me to ask. And her Twitter handle, and I guess her name too, is Tanya Hutchins. And she had a question that I thought was a great question that really falls into what we're speaking about now. Her question is, how to save a client who has already put their foot in their mouth?
Yeah, that too is one of those it depends questions, because the response to that is so contextual based on what's happening. But I saw her tweet and gave it a little bit of thought. And I think there are a few things, larger framing devices I would use to think about how to save a client who's put their foot in their mouth. First of all, I think you have to look at what the comment was and the surrounding context around that comment. And I immediately thought of a couple of celebrities. I thought about Jonah Hill, who you may remember a couple of months ago was chased down the street or followed down the street by a paparazzi. And I won't utter the entire phrase that he said, but he said, "Suck my you-know-what, you faggot." And Hill went on several talk shows, but the most memorable one was on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, immediately apologized. He had a reputation as being a defender of gay rights, and many people felt that his comment, which was pretty nasty, was more the result of having been hounded by a photographer than it was any deep underlying blind hatred for gay people. And so that was not a controversy that swirled for long. He extinguished it pretty quickly, and the foot was essentially out of his mouth at that point. He was able to move on. But that stands in marked contrast to Michael Richards, who played Kramer on Seinfeld, who you may remember almost a decade ago at this point was in a nightclub. And really, it's a disturbing video to watch. If anybody listening hasn't seen him and you're interested, pull it up on YouTube, but steel yourself because it's ugly to watch. Use the N-word many times, repeatedly, to attack a member of the audience who had heckled him. It was very ugly. The context around that one really did look like there was some deep underlying hate there. His career, all of these years later, still has not even remotely recovered. So the first thing I'd say is you have to analyze the comment and the context. The second thing I would look at is, would talking help? Sometimes it is best just to make a short statement and hope the comments disappear into the ether and have a short social media shelf life. Let the comments play out for a day or two and they're gone and you can move on. And the third part that I would look at is, if you decide that talking would help, is the spokesperson a person who's capable of being an effective enough communicator to warrant taking the risk of letting them speak? So I thought there immediately of Donald Sterling, the now former owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, who also made racially charged comments. He was obviously not capable of being a good communicator on his own behalf. In fact, the interview he gave with Anderson Cooper was such a disaster that it just hastened him losing the team. But then if you think back to somebody like Bill Clinton in 1992 running for president, who had to address these allegations of infidelity, went on 60 Minutes, and gave an interview that was so effective that it allowed him to continue pursuing the presidency. So that question of, if you decide talking would help, is that person capable of being a good enough self-advocate? So those are the larger questions I'd ask that would help a client who's put their feet in their mouth.
Awesome advice. I have a question and I guess a comment. I was reading through some of your past blog posts today for this call to kind of just get some ideas and different things. And there was one blog post that I came across, I don't remember the title, but it talked about not necessarily putting your lead, so your CEO, for example, as your spokesperson at the start of a crisis, so that you have somewhere to move up to, whether that's because the spokesperson made a mistake or because the crisis, evolves and evolves on a severe front, and you need to move up the chain of command and make sure the CEO has a presence. Do you think that strategy I think it would probably apply there? And I guess my second question is, or maybe that wasn't a question, but anyways, two thoughts off the top of my head that result from your awesome advice. The other thing is, do you think that there's a difference between personal brand making a mistake like that, putting your foot in their mouth, and a corporate organization, so the spokesperson for a corporate organization? I would think that it's probably easier, for example, Jonah Hill to come on stage and say, wow, was I ever an idiot? I'm so sorry. That's not what I meant. Those aren't my feelings. It's et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the actor who was Kramer, that's a different situation. But if it had been a comment like that, like Jonah Hill's comment from an executive or from a spokesperson within an organization, a very known organization, it would have more represented or been a representation of the organization and maybe harder to detract from or overcome.
Well, I think that's a very astute observation. There's definitely a difference between personal and organizational crises and how you can respond. I think you're seeing an example of that as we speak. Uber, the taxi company, is under fire because one of its principals made a very stupid comment about a reporter who had written critically about Uber, and that person said, well, maybe we'll look at that person's, and it was a woman, so it dragged gender into this. Maybe we'll look at her taxi history with Uber to see where she's going and when, to see if there's anything there. After all, we should be able to use that information to fight back against the negative press. So yes, that's going to be a much different type of thing to have to apologize for, try to explain away, try to move on from than the Jonah Hill example. But I do think some of the underlying principles are still the same even then. To the first question you asked about how to select the right spokesperson in a crisis, what you said is exactly right. One of the things I always think is that the person you choose to be your spokesperson in crisis communicates a lot. And what I mean by that is where that person falls on the hierarchy chart communicates a lot. If you pick somebody who's too high on the hierarchy chart to communicate, it suggests or can suggest to the public that the crisis or situation is bigger than they thought it was. And if you pick somebody too low, it can show that you're almost brazen toward the crisis itself, that you're a little bit too flippant, not taking it as seriously as it should be. And although what the excerpt that you read, that sometimes you should start with somebody lower down than higher up, so if that person makes a mistake, you can go up. I think that advice is generally good, but there are some crises that are so big and so organizationally defining that you really have no choice but to start with the person at the top of the organization.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that most people, though, when they think of crisis spokesperson or people, they think right away, oh, the CEO needs to be it. And that's kind of, yes, there are definitely situations where the CEO or the chairman needs to be the leading voice and face in the crisis. But there are so many crises as well that it doesn't necessarily need to be, or shouldn't actually be, the CEO for multiple different reasons.
Absolutely. I have an example in my book, and this came from a training that we did where I kind of had this aha moment where if there was an explosion, let's say, at a Wyoming plant, to have the company's headquarters in Chicago commenting on what happened in Laramie, Wyoming makes no sense. You would want to have the local plant manager or somebody on the scene there as your lead spokesperson, and so that's one of the reasons that you can't just have corporate spokespeople from company headquarters, media trained. You really need to make sure that the frontline personnel at each of the facilities and locations is also prepared. So in situations like that, oftentimes the CEO is the wrong person. A technical expert may be the person who's needed. Somebody local may be a much better choice. And if you're trying to communicate that you're a human company, that you get it, having somebody that's a little bit too buttoned up from a corporate office may actually be the exact wrong thing to do when trying to communicate that.
Absolutely. We have to remember the significance of appearances.
Yeah, somebody from the local community. I mean, if you are doing a hit, let's say you're doing a media appearance in a medium-sized market. I'm going to make this up just for the sake of the conversation. Let's say you're in Birmingham, Alabama, and something happens. I think that the spokesperson who lives and works, understands the community in Birmingham is often the much more effective spokesperson than showing somebody in an executive office in New York who is not of that place, has maybe never even visited that place. So, yeah, that mistake of selecting the CEO as a knee-jerk reaction can really backfire.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are starting more and more to understand it, especially when we have so many, with social media now, we have so many organizations that are facing issues on a regular basis. And issues, even though they may not be crises, while they're issues, of course, they can always escalate. But while they're issues, they can still go viral. So they can still feel overwhelming, but you still wouldn't necessarily, well, you probably wouldn't. You'd want your front line to be able to respond to, for example, an issue that's escalating and going viral that isn't a crisis, it is an issue, but still garnering a lot of attention online.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing the opposite problem a lot too, where CEOs and the management suite are reluctant to communicate when they should, and they're outsourcing the spokesperson role to a PR firm. And so somebody from a PR firm is commenting on their behalf, and that often is written into the story. This person refused to comment, a representative for their PR firm said, and that just reads terribly to members of the audience. It looks like a dodge. It looks like a lawyerly statement. So that, too, I'm trying to move people away from when they're doing that. Having people from a PR firm communicate about a product pitch or an upcoming event is absolutely fine. To do it when there's a serious issue brewing is often a big mistake.
Yep. Do you find that your clients or that the executives and the people that you work with, they get that? Like they understand it and they understand the value behind it?
I generally, my experience generally is that people get it. And I think the reason media training often can work in a day or two is because what you're really trying to do is communicate. All of this is common sense stuff. And so what you're really trying to do is help people make connections about things that are pretty logical. So if they are not thinking that way, once you're able to show them a couple of case studies and what happened and how it played out, they're usually pretty quick to come around to that. Now, I'm kind of explaining this rather cleanly. I mean, the truth is, oftentimes there's something like a corporate culture that refuses to allow it. I can't go into detail on it other than to say I worked with a private company, pretty big, millions of people in its customer base. Everybody in the communication staff got exactly what we're talking about, but the mandate from the president of the company, and again, it's a privately held company, so this president holds all of the weight, said when something like this happens, there will be no external communication. Well, everybody in the company knows that's wrong, but their hands are tied. There's nothing to do other than leave the company. So that happens a lot too, where people get it, but they're, for whatever reason, unable to act on it.
The inner workings of the large organizations.
Yeah, I'm sure you've encountered that a time or two.
Oh, yeah. And I always feel for the employees, the people with whom I'm working or have to train or coach or whatever the case may be, who, exactly like you're saying, who get it and who are just powerless and who really do love and believe in the organization, and they know that it's not the right step. It's not the right direction to be going in.
And so there, I do find that one of the values that we can bring, and, one of the really interesting things, and I'm far from the first person who's discovered this, when I was working in-house, my advice was not seen with the same credibility as it was now that I'm an external consultant who people pay to bring into their own companies. And so I think a lot of times the role that we play is really to reinforce the people internally. So you have these really smart communications professionals working within companies who know the best practices, who have been advocating for them to their leadership, but for whatever reason their voices aren't being heard. Then they bring us in as an external consultant. We say the same thing, maybe using different words or different examples, but the underlying themes are the same. And it's that role that we're playing of reinforcing what they've already heard that may tilt the balance in the favor of them finally doing the right things.
I agree. It's part of our role, empowerment and helping them come to, and that's the tricky part also, is helping them come to the right decision while making it, especially with certain types of people, making it their decision or making it their idea or concept in the first place.
That is such a smart and important point that I'm so glad you said that, because I think when I've observed other people, not everybody, but when I've observed some people doing training before, there's an inclination too many times to come in and be the smartest mind in the room and tell everybody, here's the solution, when really being the smartest person in the room often means saying just enough to lead people to make the decision on their own. And suddenly let them get the credit for being the brilliant mind that thought of this thing that you wanted them to think of and you helped them think of without them knowing that you even were leading them there, because ultimately what you're guiding them toward is the right solution for their company, but they now have the ownership over that thought instead of you.
Absolutely.
And I think that's
and
so
what value
critically
does it
important.
bring to you, and how much value does it bring to them?
Absolutely right. And so that's a really, in terms of the psychology of what we do and helping lead people to solutions, is critically important. They must own the solution themselves.
Absolutely. I agree. And then there's also the types of people who they want to own the decision themselves. So it's doing the same thing. It's just reading people at the onset of, you coming into the company as a consultant and helping exactly that, seeing the end game, seeing where they need to get, seeing where they hired you to help them get, and then figuring out who you're working with, their types of personalities, and the best way to strategically help them get there.
Absolutely. I'll give you a specific example of that if you'd like. This is a case in which you have an executive who's very controlling, and you do a practice interview with them, and they will give you 8-minute answers for a question that really deserved a 2-sentence answer. And everybody in the company wants to tear their hair out because they know what a disaster it is when the executive goes on that far. And so what I'll sit across from the executive and say is, I'm surprised, because typically when I work with executives, they really want to have some control over the interview, but that doesn't seem to be particularly important to you. Well, of course, that makes them say, well, of course I want to be in control. What are you talking about? And it's kind of a cheeky way of making that point to them. So yeah, you always have to be aware of communicating in different ways to different types of people for them to produce the aha moment on their own.
Absolutely. You can't give them that. You can't give them the aha moment.
Right. You can't be the anvil hitting them over the head.
That's it. You can't have the aha moment and expect for them to have the same aha moment, I guess is what I was trying to say.
Exactly right.
So how do you feel looking at social media and the real-time news cycle that is today? How have you seen that impact your trainings, for one, but also in the sense of a spokesperson feeling that, or just crisis communicators feeling and knowing that they need to communicate in real time, they need to get ahead of the story and all when they do get that, actually. How has that impacted both your training and also just the experiences in the real, in the moment experiences for the people that you train? Did that make sense?
I think the biggest thing with social media that I see is that people are very aware of the challenges of social media in crisis, and as a result, I think they too often underestimate the potential benefits of social media in crisis. So as an overall statement of what I see when this discussion comes up, that's it. And the point I always try to make to people is, yes, there are challenges, but the benefits of being present in your own coverage, allowing you to demonstrate your competence in real time without a media filter, without an intermediary between you and your audience, is huge. So you are able to extinguish, using social media, depending on the context and the situation, of course, a budding crisis before the flames ever grow too high. So that's a huge advantage that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so people should not only focus on the negatives. In terms of responding quickly, I think that's always been the case. It's just that the timeline has gotten shorter. I always think about something that Eric Desenhall, a crisis communications professional in our industry based in D.C., wrote in his book, Damage Control. He brings up this Tylenol case from 1982. This was the example of cyanide being purposely put in some of its capsules. And it's still held up to this day, 30-some years later, as an example of brilliant crisis communications. Well, in 1982 it was. But the point he makes in the book is if a company waited for almost a week, I think they waited 5 days to pull the product from the shelves, they would be crucified on social media for waiting so long. So that timeline has shrunk. I would say if that happened today, the product would almost have to be pulled within a day for them to be able to accomplish what they tried to do at 5 days just 30 years ago. So I think those are some of the things with social media that tend to come up in our conversations pretty often.
In that case in particular, as an example, that actually would have needed to be on a crisis management front. Pulling the items off of the shelves needs to be the knee-jerk reaction. It would have needed to be, especially today, the absolute first thing, and would be more important to do that. And then, of course, to communicate that you're doing that, more important than actually releasing an official response. Because that in itself, that action is an official response.
So how long do you think, and I know you're the interviewer here, but if I could
go ahead.
impose one question on you. So let's say you're sitting in Johnson & Johnson headquarters and you get a call that there was one capsule that you think had cyanide in it. You don't know how it got there. You don't know if it's an anomaly or a trend yet. Do you pull the entire product line immediately? Do you pull it just from that local market? I think those questions are still really tough to answer. I know the right thing to do is pull it, but the question is, do you need more than one case to pull an entire product line nationally?
If and in this hypothetical, somebody has been poisoned with cyanide, and all things are leading to the fact that it most likely came from the Tylenol pill that they took. I'm asking, is that kind of the picture that's being painted?
Right, that's it.
Then yes, it needs, and if not, maybe it wouldn't need to go national at that moment, but the very first thing, if one person has been poisoned with cyanide and the media is going to report or is already reporting that it was due to Tylenol, that company needs to be seen as taking the action, the immediate action to prevent that from happening to others. And in order to do that, the only thing you can do is pull them off the shelves.
Right. So, I mean, what we're really saying is that the response of the media, the increasing sensationalism of the media, Ebola being a good example, is forcing companies to take financial hits that are multi millions of dollars for preserving their reputation and brands, even when it may not be the most rational decision. In other words, you have to act before the information is even in, which would help you make a better decision. Just because the media coverage will be so intense that you have to do it, even if it later proves to have been complete overkill.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, it wouldn't have had to be, in this hypothetical situation, you wouldn't have to do it nationally if there was one report of one incident in one area. But at the same time, thinking about pulling even just from that region, pulling everything off the shelf in that region, and the monetary impact, of course, that's going to follow that. However, the impact of you putting, or the company putting, life of your customers ahead of your bottom line, that's priceless. As in terms of your reputation, in terms of instilling credibility, gaining trust, and will probably, that smart move and that emotional intelligence will probably positively impact the organization for the long run, way more than what would have happened had it never happened.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it becomes much more challenging when it's not Johnson & Johnson and it's a smaller, mid-sized company that can be financially almost put out of business rather, by having to make that decision. I think it's easier for a company of J&J's size to be able to pull that off.
Yep. And at the same time, crises are crises for a reason. They're not, and that's why sometimes I'll get the question of, so how can we plan for every single type of scenario? The reality is you can't. You can think of different scenarios, you can categorize those scenarios and plan for the different types of categories of crisis, which is the smartest thing you can do. But in no way could you plan for every single type of scenario, because even just one scenario, for example, like that, there are so many different factors that play into and that you have to use and understand and know in order to give the right response. It's not linear. Crisis management is not a linear approach.
Absolutely. And, one of the really interesting things that happens a lot when we do crisis scenarios with our clients is we'll give a scenario, and they will, and sometimes we're using a scenario they've actually encountered before, which is even better. And we try to come up with, well, what are the right messages? What do you want to communicate when we do this? And at this point in the training, I usually pull myself out and I let them have the conversation amongst themselves to try to develop the best messaging. And I let this go on for about 15 minutes. And oftentimes they're tying themselves in knots, trying to come up with the exact right message and the right language. And, well, we can't say this or this or this. Maybe we should say this. I don't know. Remember, we can't say this for legal reasons. So I let this go on for a while. And then I'll jump in about 15 minutes in and I'll say, just off the record, just for my own understanding, what's the real answer? And they'll tell me the real answer. And I would estimate 7 or 8 times out of 10, that's the answer they should be using with the media. That so many times they're twisting themselves in knots unnecessarily when just communicating what they want to say was actually the right thing all along.
I love that you're bringing up that point. I see the same thing Agnes Day does a lot of crisis simulations, and we have a tool that simulates everything from social media to the news cycle to Google, et cetera, where we have to, and then of course we have the traditional side of things where people are calling in, role playing and pretending to be reporters or different stakeholders. And it's, okay, so for example, I did one last week, and it was a very, very viral, very severe crisis was the scenario. And this is actually the second time we go into the company. We went in 4 or 5 months ago, and they didn't actually manage the scenario that we threw at them, which was a surprise to us because this is a really savvy, really smart organization. They didn't manage the crisis, or not successfully anyways, within the 4 hours of allotted time. And so we came back in last week to put them through a fresh scenario, but testing the same attributes within their organization. And what we saw, the biggest takeaway in, and I see it all the time, but in this particular case, was at the time, so say maybe 3 hours into the exercise, they understood everything that was going on, everything that was being thrown at them. They had it clearly, outlined in or mapped out in their minds and on their tables. And they knew what they needed to do. They knew that they needed to first calm the media frenzy and the social media frenzy and put out these statements. And they had approval. The social team, the frontline had approval from the executive team of what to say. It still took them 1 hour from the time that decision was made to actually put out the first statement. And the first statement was by nowhere near the only statement needed to go out. So that time, that 1 hour of time between when they got approval and knew exactly what to do and then actually implemented what they did, first of all, we got to escalate the crisis further because we have control in the heat of in these exercises and we can show impact. So we got to escalate it further, which would not have happened. And what we realized was that they were focusing too hard on the exact terms. No, we can't use that term. No, we can't say that word. We can't use that word. As opposed to realizing that social media, calming the frenzy on social in these types of situations and correcting rumors and stopping things from going viral and starting to become the narrative of your own story, of your own crisis, is about time and efficiency rather than the perfect word or the perfect term. Focus on the perfect term for your official statement and for your spokesperson's, press conference, but not on social media. So I love that you use that example because it's something that we see behind the scenes far too often. And the result was that they almost didn't manage the crisis successfully by the time the end of the timer stopped for the exercise. But not just that, but they could have managed it 1 hour earlier and had lunch 1 hour earlier.
Right. I mean, what a great takeaway for them, too. I mean, you had brought up the point, which I agree with completely, that you can't plan for every crisis because there's far too many to be able, and far too many factors. But what you do hope to develop is a muscle memory that certain things if a crisis hits, we know certain things. A, we're going to respond quickly. B, we're not going to get bogged down in wordsmithing everything to its death at the exclusion of being able to say the things we must say quickly. One other thing I would add to what you've said, and this was an aha moment for me recently. I worked with a client. We were doing press conference drills because this client gave a lot of press conferences, and they hated the media. I mean, I have a lot of groups that have some kind of antipathy toward the media, but this group really thought that the media had it out for them, that they were almost immoral people. And so we did an interesting exercise. Half the people were the spokespeople for the company, but I asked the other half to play the role of the reporters during the press conference. And I asked them both to go off to their sides and the corporate spokespeople to develop what do you want to say during the press conference and stay as close to those messages as you can. And to the reporters, I said, don't be satisfied with the corporate spin. Get behind the spin with your questions. Well, what was really interesting after the mock press conference was I asked the spokespeople, how did you feel? And they said, I hated the media. But then I asked the half of the group that played the role of the reporters, how did you feel during the press conference? And they said, we were pissed. These people didn't answer our questions. They were spinning us. And all of a sudden they understood what it was to feel like a journalist who's not being given a direct answer. It was a revelatory answer, and it completely changed the way that they approached putting their own internal messages together because they suddenly, for the first time, understood that kind of spin wasn't satisfying to anybody.
Oh, I love that. I love that you provided them with an aha moment by flipping their side, their angle of a situation that they see often.
I wish I could claim being so brilliant that I did that by design. It almost happened accidentally. But now that I've learned that, you better believe I'll be repeating the exercise over and over again.
Absolutely. Talking about just muscle memory, I love that you use that term and that's the importance of both of what we both do, I should say. Your media training and my simulations is practice is the only way to make perfect. So often we see in a simulation or in a real crisis, the crisis team, they're focusing on the book. They're focusing on the crisis manual that is designed to take them step by step through a perfectly scenario crisis. And you have no idea how many times in both a real crisis and in a simulation I hear the leader, the crisis communications leader, turn to somebody and say, "Get rid of the damn book, throw it away. It's stopping us. Literally, it's stopping us." And so that's the importance of the muscle memory, is to practice these things so that almost, crisis communication or different aspects of crisis communication, whether it's, putting together and conducting a press conference, or it's putting out your communications on social, that it becomes second nature and that you don't have to fall back on the book.
Yes. And, to help your listeners develop that muscle memory, because not everybody's going to have the opportunity to do a press conference on a regular basis. Don't allow yourself to be a passive observer of news. Really be active. When you see a crisis swirling, I mentioned the Bill Cosby crisis, or the crisis affecting Uber right now as we record this. Don't just read the story and at the end of reading the story think to yourself, "Oh, Uber's really blowing this." Be really critical in your analysis. What are they doing wrong here? What are they doing right? If I was in this situation, what would I do differently? When you're watching the evening news, if anybody still does that anymore, watching the cable news networks, if anybody does that anymore, really be an active participant in trying to figure out, I really like this spokesperson because he or she is doing this, or the opposite, what they're not doing well, because I think those are all ways, or read stories, go visit blogs, visit websites that are PR specific websites, and aggregate these types of stories, so that's another way beyond just the mock interviews and the simulations, which, by the way, I think is irreplaceable. I think you have to do those. But if you haven't done those yet, at the very least, try to become an active participant in observing what's happening around you instead of simply reading it passively.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's a great tip. I'd even go a step further and say, maybe not always, but every once in a while, actually put your what you think is a better solution, actually test it out, write it down. So if you don't like a statement from a spokesperson, for example, who's speaking on a subject, on a crisis or an issue, don't just kind of pick out what you don't like. Know that stuff, absolutely. But then go and actually write a statement that you would rather have heard come out of that person's mouth, because the act of doing goes even a step above just recognizing.
I love that. And, I kind of fear that I'm going to admit being a little bit nuts, but there are times when I almost have the conversation with myself when I'm walking to work or getting ready in the morning, and I'll have just seen an interview and I suddenly put myself in the role of the spokesperson. Okay, Matt Lauer asked me that question. What do I say? And I'm in my mind, I'm not saying it out loud, but I'm role playing in that situation. How would I do that better? So yes, that kind of exercise you're describing, I think, will really help the muscle memory be there when it's needed, when you need to react quickly, but you don't have 3 hours to get all the words exactly precise.
Absolutely. I know that I'm taking up so much of your time. I want to ask you one more question. I have so many more questions. I wish I have time to ask you, but it's something that I say often when I'm talking when I'm talking about crisis communications, actually. And so one of the things is that, especially in North America, a crisis, no matter what, one of many questions, or a very common question is always, what channel should we be on pre-crisis? What channel should we use in a crisis? Although that answer depends on your audiences, there's no one size fits all, or because one organization is on Facebook necessarily means that your stakeholders are on Facebook. However, I do always say that, especially for North Americans, Twitter is a channel that you need to be on pre-crisis and understand how to use it in a crisis, because everybody's on Twitter, from the media to definitely your stakeholders or different members actually of, your audiences and stakeholder groups, as well as the general public that you need to be communicating with. So with that in mind, I'm always looking for ways to inspire spokespeople, but also, crisis communicators to make their communications Twitter friendly. So I'm always giving tips like, Make your sound bites or your key message statements from 100, as much as you can, from 100 to 120 characters in length, so that they don't get lost in translation if you know that the media and that others are going to be tweeting what you're saying. Make sure that your most important statements fit into a tweet, that they don't have to get lost in translation. And different tidbits like that. Is there anything that you've seen or that you've experienced or that you teach that you can go even beyond that in terms of tips or advice for others for taking their communications, their crisis communications, and making it even more social media friendly when we know that a crisis is going to unfold on social? And even if you hold a press conference and it airs on national television, it's going to be streamed online and it's going to be shared and tweeted about, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, absolutely. And the advice you're giving people there is spot on. I have a specific tip that I'll give people, but the first thing I'd say is just keep in mind that most sound bites that you hear are pre-planned. They're not spontaneous. In our sessions, I usually bring up, how many of you remember the sound bite that O.J. Simpson's lawyer uttered during his trial? And somebody will say, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. I mean, people remember that 20 years later. Well, that was a planned line. Same thing in 2012 in one of the presidential debates. President Obama, in response to Mitt Romney's assertion that that Obama wasn't strong on the military, Obama's retort was to say, Governor Romney, the nature of our military has changed. We no longer use horses and bayonets. Well, I guarantee you that line wasn't spontaneous. It was pre-planned, and that line that I just mentioned, the horses and bayonets line, was the most tweeted moment of that 2012 debate. So that proves the point that pre-planning them works. So the question then becomes, how do you pre-plan them? And this is where I would issue a specific tip to people. It is very difficult, in my experience, for people to sit around a boardroom and create clever or witty sound bites that people will repeat. It tends to be it tends to be a creative exercise, and so to force yourself to do it more analytically, I find usually doesn't work well. So what I would suggest to people, when you want to come up with sound bites, and this is true for media or crisis, either when you're engaging in conversation with your colleagues and your friends, when you're out to dinner with your parents or your children, really pay attention to the language people are using when they're talking to you, and pay attention to the language that you're using when you're not even focusing too much on what you're saying. Because oftentimes there's a nugget there. There's a soundbite that you're using that you never capture. And I analogize it. I know this sounds obvious, but I analogize it to, think about the times when you hear a word, you don't know what the word means, so you go to the dictionary to look it up, and suddenly you hear the word 3 times in the next week. Well, the truth is that word has been around you all the time. You just haven't been listening for it. And the same, in my experience, is true for soundbites. So when you do those simulations, when you draft those crisis statements, like you suggested, really pay attention to the language that you're using then, because it's much easier to pluck it out of those situations than it is to sit around a table and try to plan them.
I love that answer. Awesome advice. Brad, thank you so much. I've had such a great time chatting with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. And for everybody who is listening, Brad wrote an awesome book that awesome doesn't even describe it. It is like, you know what? I think, Brad, that you should take this book and make, I don't even know how you could do it because it would be super thick, but a compact version that fits in a pocket. I guess we do that with mobile technology. But let me start at the beginning. It's called The Media Training Bible, 101 Things You Absolutely Positively Need to Know Before Your Next Interview. And I swear it really is the Media Training Bible. When I read it, I felt like owning a copy of this book gave me Brad Phillips in my pocket whenever I needed him. So I definitely recommend, and I'm going to put a link, there will be a link in the show notes of this podcast to all of the places that you can connect with Brad, which I'm going to ask you to share with everybody now, but also to purchase the book, whether it's the material version or the e-version, within the show notes below this podcast, no matter where you're listening to it, whether it's from the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com, iTunes, or Stitcher. So with that said, where can everybody find and follow you, Brad?
Well, thank you, first of all, for those very nice comments. And I've known that you're a great blogger, but now I know you're also a great broadcast journalist. So thank you for a great conversation. The book itself, I'd love to claim credit for all of the thinking behind it, but the truth is that the blog, it's Mr. Media Training, mrmediatraining.com, is almost the proving ground where I write something that I think is right, and occasionally I get pushback from readers, or people will just add their own thoughts to it. And so you see some of that thinking reflected in the book. So I'd encourage people, visit the website, participate. Your thinking really helps make me better at what I'm trying to do as a media trainer. So Mr. Media Training is one way. On Twitter at Mr. Media Training, and same thing on Facebook, although I discourage people a little bit from Facebook now because they don't show up in organic reach. People are not able to see me in their feed. So Twitter, the blog, or our newsletter, which you could sign up for from the blog, are the best ways to remain in touch.
Very cool. And, to your note about, I think that everybody's feedback and the things that we read really does shape us as a blogger and keeps our eyes open and our thoughts and ideas fresh to provide new and fresh material for our readers. But I can say from experience to those of you listening that if you have a question about anything around Brad's topic on media training and media skills and, spokespeople, if you email Brad your questions, he will write you answers in his blog because you've done it countless times for me. So,
I'd be happy to contact at mrmediatraining.com. And I love when people write in with smart questions. And so please use me as a free resource. It provides great blog material for everybody else and will hopefully help you out along the way.
Thank you so much for your time, Brad.
Thank you, Melissa.
So this is a bonus piece that we've never done before in the Crisis Intelligence podcast that I'm really excited to do because this hour-long conversation with Brad Phillips was just not enough. And I still have all kinds of questions that I know you guys have because I get them from you all the time. So Brad, are you ready for a lightning round?
Yes, very quick answers. Here we go.
Okay, number one, what is the... I'm not fast enough for my lightning round. Okay, the top questions you get asked in terms of for spokespeople for media training.
We actually covered that one already. The question is, who should be the spokesperson? I use as the guides for that somebody who has the head and the heart, somebody who is not too high but not too low on the hierarchy chart, and somebody at the right location, whether it's a corporate spokesperson at a national headquarters or somebody on the scene locally.
If every employee is a spokesperson for their organization, which they in fact are, so that's a true statement, what does this require in terms of any level of media training for different members or every member of an organization's team?
It means that if you train your executives, but you don't train your receptionist, the training you did with your executives is useless. Because all it takes is one phone call to the receptionist who says one thing that indicates that there is indeed a crisis or something happening or confirms the reporter's story, and all of your efforts with you in the simulation room or me in the training room are completely undermined.
Top needs that you see that absolutely need to be met when in terms of a spokesperson in a crisis.
Top needs that have to be met in terms of personal qualities?
Anything that comes to mind.
I would say that the person has to be perceived as candid. That does not mean that you have to say everything that pops into your head, but it does mean that if you can't communicate something because you either don't know it or you're not authorized to say it, the public, you should explain why you can't say more, and the public should get this strong sense that you are a straight shooter.
Two-part question. The biggest mistakes that you see continually being made by spokespersons in a crisis, that's part one. Part two is how can people avoid them?
I would say one of the biggest mistakes that we didn't cover before is that they apologize the wrong way. The natural human instinct when somebody's accused of doing something is to defend themselves and say, you're misinterpreting my motives, which may be true, but that statement does nothing to satisfy the swirling controversy. And so days later, usually they come back and finally issue the better apology. So the biggest mistake is that they don't issue that second apology first instead of waiting several days and doing it second. The way to fix that, of course, is just to give the second apology first.
And last but not least, ideally and realistically, how often should spokespersons be trained per year with an actual media training exercise?
I'd say once a year is usually sufficient, but what I would say is in the interim between those year and a half between trainings, do what we talked about in the full podcast, which is to say, be an active participant. Don't ever watch the news uncritically again. Really dissect what you're seeing unfold in front of you and challenge yourself with what you would do differently to make it better.
Anything that you want to add that I didn't ask?
Melissa, I think you've covered everything. And the only thing I would add back to the question about when I said the receptionist, train your receptionist, the only thing I want to say is you don't have to spend thousands of dollars for a media trainer to train your receptionist. Just have a one-pager. Give it to every receptionist. Give it to your security guards in front of your facility. Even in some cases, give it to spouses of the men and women who work for your firm so that when they get an unexpected call, they at least know what the procedure was and where those calls should be routed. You could do it for free, but if you have a temp sitting in the receptionist chair for a single day, make sure that temp gets that one pager, because that could be the day that something goes wrong.
Brad, you totally rock. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast with me, Melissa Agnes. I release a new episode every Sunday, so if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to this Crisis Intelligence Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher so you don't miss out on any future episodes. While you're at it, feel free to leave me a rating or review on iTunes. This will go such a long way in helping me get this important information to more people just like you to help benefit their crisis management and crisis communications. Additionally, if you'd like to have me come and speak at an upcoming event that you may be organizing, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. You can email me at melissa@melissaagnes.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.